and prostitution, because they're also the consumers. They are the sexual consumers of tomorrow. So at that age, we found out that about half of them are already buying women. So the impact of the socialization of young men is such that there's no possibility for them to be changing their minds at age 30. They would continue to be predators, and I think this is an opportunity that for us to target the kind of sector and the ages that will likely change, have the possibility of change. And we've seen that these guys are all consumers of pornography. We've trained about 1,000 in the Philippines. There's one group in Thailand, in Indonesia, and India. We're not saying that this is going to solve the problem, but it's a start. And this should be like the struggle by men about themselves. Women are going to help, but the men themselves have to take up this issue of what kind of masculinity you want to be. The second is, I think, also the education of the security sector. Part of the security sector reform, training of peacekeeping forces and gender equality. There is such. We do that in the Philippines for our peacekeeping forces, our military, our police, etc. So those are the groups of frontliners that need to be educated on this. But I'm not saying it's only the boys and young men that should be, the young girls as well, must be aware that they have rights, that they must not submit to, to these types of harassment that they usually meet in public spaces, in schools, and such. The education of young women and young men is the first step, and the security sector. We also, as far as the trafficking is concerned, I'm very glad you brought that up. I'm aware about the trafficking in Iraq because we got the reports about a few years back in the coalition. And I think among the best practices that our regional chapters have reported is one, begin with the community. One should develop teachers, professionals, and involve everybody. This is a community problem. It's not a problem of families whose daughters are disappearing. It's a problem of society. So everybody's got to be involved. So in many parts of Bangladesh, India, Philippines, we have what we call traffic watch, beginning with the community themselves. Yes. So those are just a few things and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Should we just take it maybe this way?
Sure. Just a little bit more in the men and boys. I mean, I completely agree with Arroyo that you need to start with the boys, but I also think we need to think about the role that women play and mothers play, because those boys are being socialized into a world that tells them they have privileges, that they're more special than the girls. And so we need to be looking at where are those positive role models in the community, and how do we promote, as Arroyo said, a different kind of masculinity, and allow people to deconstruct some of what society is imposing. And to the question about prevention and how that's different in conflict, I think it's a really interesting question, and I certainly don't have an answer. But I think I guess my question back would be, is there less gender-based violence in Central America than perhaps in the Eastern DRC, or is it a different kind of gender-based violence? I mean, we hear reports of a huge amount of domestic violence, for example, in Central America. And is it that some of those support structures are still in place that allow for some of the, actually build out that protection environment against things like stranger rape and those things in a way that no longer exist in the Eastern DRC? I mean, I think there's a lot we have to learn there yet.
And I wanted to answer your question about the premise of, is there less sexual violence in some locations than others? I think I would start first with challenging the premise as to whether that's true. If you look at some of the old studies, the Peruvian Truth Commission, they determined years ago that there was a very small percentage of sexual violence, but when a sociologist, Michelle Leiby, went back and reviewed thousands and thousands of hours of transcripts, of interviews, found that many times the questions were not being asked. They were asked in such a way that predetermined the answers, and with a reevaluation of that of those findings that there was actually significant sexual violence that was committed. I think initially with the Sri Lankan Commission of Inquiry, it was determined that there was very little sexual violence, and in subsequent commissions that there has been also significant sexual violence committed. So as an investigator, I know that you can determine your results by how you do your investigation and how you do your interviewing. So if I don't want to find sexual violence, I can make sure that I don't find sexual violence. That may not have been such a necessarily a conscious decision on the part of prosecutors, investigators, documenters, but it may have been very much an unconscious decision. And in terms of the indicators, once again, I think we've seen that any times there is detention, there's imprisonment, there's recruitment of child soldiers, there's enslavement, there's trafficking, there's armed groups, there's home raids, that there's any differences in power, that we find sexual violence, and to also be aware that we're seeing, I don't know if it's more, but just more reporting of sexual violence of male victims as well as female victims.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Alexandra.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to respond to the question on aid conditionality,
You were
but I'm
looking
glad
right
to know your name as well.
Brian.
Brian, thanks for your question. I think part of the reason why Brian's question about aid conditionality is relevant is because within the context of the passage of new forms of homophobic and transphobic laws that actually incentivize violence against LGBTI people by both state and non-state actors, some governments have asked whether aid conditionality would be a proper response, and David Cameron in 2011 really was the unfortunate pioneer, very publicly, I would argue, sticking his foot in his mouth on this issue. For those that haven't been following this issue obsessively, like some of us, the argument for aid conditionality in response to new forms of homophobia and transphobia in the law is really twofold. One, there are always conditions on foreign assistance, and so whether you're talking about the condition of good governance or the funds being used for the designated targets, this just introduces another form of conditionality. Another argument in favor of aid conditionality is that foreign policy should be infused with human rights standards. So, a government should no more support funding to another country that supports the death penalty than they should for a government that criminalizes sodomy. The argument against aid conditionality was, I think, has been very eloquently put forth by many different social movements, and in response to David Cameron's comments, was very quickly responded to by a coalition of African civil society organizations and activists. And the argument basically includes three key principles. One, that aid conditionality actually feeds a backlash against the very people that it's designed to assist. It separates LGBTI identities from identities as citizens, and LGBT rights as separate from poverty alleviation, and LGBT people as separate from other vulnerable groups. So in that scenario, the scenario that brought about the discussion, it was, effectively, you are LGBT or you are Ugandan, right? And these are mutually exclusive categories. And I think this whole this part of the critique is that it feeds into the very harmful notion that LGBT people are not homegrown to any place other than the West, but a product of Western colonial imposition. Just very quickly, my 2 cents, aid conditionality is bad. You shouldn't condition humanitarian assistance. But what I think is good is investing in local community-based organizations and also investing in programs that are designed to provide humanitarian relief that actually reach all of the parts of the community. Because I think if you want to do HIV and AIDS programming, but not everyone can access the HIV and AIDS programs, then it's probably not the most effective method for redress. So in my opinion, aid conditionality bad, best practices good.
Thank you. So thank you very much to all our panelists. I'm afraid we have to wrap it up now because we'll take a few moments for some closing remarks at the end of this conference.